Hello, I'm Toyka and welcome back to the second channel geography video. This is Everyone's favorite series where I talk about geography and the world and stuff. And today I wanted to talk about borders again because I find borders fascinating. I know like literally every other video is borders at this point, but I really love that borders are the story of where we just decided to draw a line in the sand and say on one side of the border is one country and on the other side is another country. It's just a thing we do all over the world. It's fascinating, and also a lot of people really enjoyed the German borders video where I spoke about every single German border and the weird irregularities with it, and I figured why not do that for another country, because, you know, like I really like talking about specific borders, and I figured if I can pick any country in the world, why not pick one of my favorites? So we're going to be talking about Norway today, because I really love Norway. It's the land of exceptions, and my only proof to loving Norway is that I went on a train journey once from Bergen to Oslo. It's one of the most beautiful train journeys in the world. It goes through like mountains. It took 6.5 hours, but I genuinely enjoyed the whole thing. Like, it was one of the most scenic ways to do it instead of like an hour flight or something. And my second piece of proof, in case you don't believe that, you're like, well, you just maybe made that up. I looked it up. I actually have a hat right here I bought in Norway, and given how expensive Norway is, that's how you know it's real. Basically, it's a hat that says Norge, which is Norwegian for Norway, and it has the Norwegian flag on, which again, I really do think is one of the most beautiful flags in the world. Like, I feel like I would live in Norway if it wasn't so expensive. Anyway, with that said, let's talk about Norway's borders and Norway's weird exceptions, because it is the land of exceptions, and I wanted to talk about those in today's video. So, with that said, let's get straight into it, and let's start by talking about the big exceptions of Norway, because if you're not familiar with the European landscape, this is like extra confusing, but Norway is not in the EU, but is in NATO, kind of being the opposite of its nearby brothers. So if you look on this map right here, you can see purple countries is EU, NATO, blue is just EU, and orange is just NATO. Norway is surrounded by, you know, it's got two borders with neutral countries, and then there's Russia, the pure aggressor. So they've got this really weird NATO kind of agreement, and I think the simple answer is that Norway signs agreements that are very beneficial towards itself. Norway is a very, very high income country, because oil, you can mostly say, but they actually invested that, and now they've got like the richest sovereign wealth fund in the world. They fund like the deforestation in they fund not deforesting the Amazon forest in Brazil, and basically there's just a lot of crazy cool things they can do because they're so wealthy, and one of those is not being part of the EU. So they still pay money to be essentially in the EU, and they're part of the EEA, which means that people can go to and from Norway entirely free of charge. However, they're not subject to all of the regulations from the EU, and also that means that goods cannot get into Norway without a charge, which means you have this really weird situation, at least in my opinion, where to get into Norway as a person, it's entirely fine. Your passport is not checked, or it's not meant to be checked, or you can get in without it being checked, is my point. However, the goods that you bring with you, they have to be checked, and also that means the taxes between Norway and Sweden and Norway and Finland actually, you can actually claim them back when you go from one to the other. It's weird stuff, but yeah, you can see it's like an airport. Buses and lorries are always checked, and they're nothing to declare people. It's like 1 in 1,000 checks, but you can mostly get there friction free, but in theory your goods have to be checked, and that means they do check every single lorry coming across the border, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, that like, oh yeah, anyone can go into Norway if you're in Europe, but not your goods. They have to be checked. I've always thought that's weird. It's kind of like a reversed UK situation where your goods can't be checked, but you actually, we're going to do some passport checks. So just a fun little fact about Norway, again, being the exception, being the opposite. They're NATO but not EU. People can go in but not goods. Everything's just a little bit opposite there. And also, while we're speaking of opposites, they have this very interesting system going on. So basically looking at their border, because their border is this interesting thing where it looks like it's just a random jiggly-jaggedy line. Like if you look at most borders like this, it's just a lot of like curvatures going everywhere. But the Norway-Sweden border is actually a really smooth border, for the northern part at least. So the northern part is just a lot of clearly defined points, because I believe it's like the drainage point. So everything on the Norwegian side, or all the rivers on the Norwegian side, go towards the Norwegian Sea, and everything on the Swedish side go towards the Gulf over there, which is, I think that's interesting. So yeah, here you can see that's what most of these points are. So you can see how it's just a point to a point to a point. So it's actually a lot of straight lines, but it's smart straight lines, so that it doesn't cut off villages like this, although this one looks like it kind of is, but they're smart straight lines that are designed to actually have like the key thing, and the reason they can be easy straight lines, and the reason there's no contention with this border up here, is because realistically no one actually lives there. The border with, most borders in Europe, they're a source of major wars and contention, and even to this day, for instance, I said like the German-Poland border causes some issues, only with some people apparently, but it does cause some issues. For some people, the German-Denmark border, for some people, like the Swiss, there's a lot of different borders in Europe which cause contention to this day, but the Norwegian-Swedish border up here is pretty much fine because they don't really care about this land too much, because most of the Norwegian population, and indeed most of Swedish, but we'll talk about Norway right now, most of the Norwegian population lives on the outer edges. Like when you zoom in, you see there's towns everywhere, like even in the middle, but when we're talking about size, by population and by actual size, the biggest city is over here, Oslo, as you can see, on the sea. Then it's Bergen, as you can see, got direct sea access. Then it's, after that, there is Stavanger over here, as you can see, sea access. Then we got Trondheim, wow, it's the exact same thing. And then it's Kristiansand over here. So basically, pretty much all of their, cities and towns till you get to like, it's something like 15 on the list before you're like, oh yeah, it's slightly inland to find Hamar. And yeah, basically most of the Norwegian population is at the coast, which means this is the valuable bit. This is the bit that's like kind of worth going for, which means the only real contentious part of their border is the one with Russia, where they've dissolved all the disputes now, but it's not an entire thing like that. So yeah, basically, like I said, the border with Sweden, pretty easy to define because it's like, we don't really care about too much of that. There's not too much to be done. Sweden looks like it got the way better deal. So Sweden has much more land area, but it doesn't affect the actual populations because this is the Swedish population centers for the most part. I mean, you can see there's villages running through there, and this is the Norwegian population centers going around the edges, which means that the only real contentious part of the border is around to just about here, the Oslo surrounding areas. And the long story short behind this is that it's gone back and forth. Norway's had to really fight for this several times, but we kind of settled on where we are today, with interestingly one of the few borders that Google Maps displays going into the ocean like this in a really weird way. So yeah, they mostly sailed it along rivers, but then also they just have points to point, villages to villages. It's one of those weird like stories of the villages and borders stuff. And again, there's only a certain number of ways into Norway from Sweden. You might think the border this big, they've got so many crossings, but it's something like there's 8 border crossings you can officially cross at, because just so much of this doesn't even have roads in it. Like, are you ever going to cross from Norway to Sweden there, or Sweden to Norway there? Or vice versa? Probably not, right? I mean, it just, it's not the right terrain to do so. So yeah, realistically, there is a way you could theoretically do it, but it's not done, and that is why the Norwegian-Swedish border is pretty easy to manage despite the weird opposite land rules that have to apply, and that's something that's kind of fascinating. So Norway and Sweden, despite having most of the border that Norway has, kind of just have a really chill thing going on. And then Norway and Finland have it even more chill. It's like, guess what? We've got something like 3 border crossings going in and out of Norway to Sweden. It's 4, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So as you can see, there's just a few, like one there, one over here, and then one up there. It's easy as that, 4 separate road crossings, despite the fact that they share, it's something like, let's measure the exact distance, so you can see, it's over, because that's the point to point. There's something, there's like 400, 500 kilometers off border. We could measure it point to point like this, but there's 400 kilometers of border with Finland, but there's only 4 border crossings for that, because again, it's the same thing where it's the inland of Finland, the really far out stuff, and it's the part of, Norway, where there's also not very much going on. In fact, I mentioned this before, but the very top part of Norway is actually called Finnmark. So Finnmark, I'll show you on a map right here. So Finnmark, Norway, is this area right here, and it's one of the most interesting parts of Norway to me, because if we look at a Norway county map, you can see them all. It's like most of the stuff's going on there. Again, the inland has bigger counties because there's generally less going on. But then when you get to really far north, you get the interesting stuff. So I want to also make a correction to a previous video. I've spoken about Norway a lot. Again, I have a Norway hat. Is that proof for you? But I actually mentioned how Tromsø was in Finnmark once, and I was wrong about that. I made a wrong assumption, and I apologize for that. But as it turns out, eventually these two counties are going to merge. So in 3 years' time, that statement will be right. And a part of me really likes that. Like, yeah, that's what I meant all along. I was just talking about 5 years in the future. But no, there is 2 separate counties. There's Troms and there's Finnmark. And interestingly, there's like a increase in the Sami native population as you go up here. Because like I said, most people who live in Norway are Norwegian and speak Norwegian in 2 varieties actually. In fact, let me just quickly show you. There's 2 types of Norwegian. There's like Old Norwegian and New York Norwegian, which is blue is the newish one, but the new one's based on Old Norwegian speak, whereas the red is like traditional, but confusing stuff basically. But my point being is that kind of gets less so. There's less Norwegian people up here, and there's more Sami native people, which is kind of the story with native people everywhere. Like, oh yeah, well we wanted borders, so we kind of just pushed them out, and they got spread across national boundaries. Some Swedish people, there's some Swedish Sami, there's some Finnish Sami, and there's even some Russian Sami. Kind of fascinating. But yeah, so this county right here is quite fascinating because it shares most of the borders that Norway actually has, even though it has very little population and yeah, essentially none of the stuff going on. And also quite interestingly with the border, before we actually move on to Russia, because that's where I think interesting stuff comes in, is the fact that Norway and Finland share a border, and the border, because Finland is a very flat country, their tallest peak is like, their tallest peak is along the Norwegian border, but it actually ends up being in Finland. One of the things that was a really popular internet campaign was to give to give Finland the mountain for their birthday. They had their 100th birthday very recently, actually, and it almost went down. They really wanted it to happen. Look, they were going to give them a peak because Norway's so nice. They'll give their friends a mountain so they can have a higher peak. But it actually didn't actually end up happening. And again, I've heard a lot of people say it did happen. It didn't. Apparently, the Norwegian constitution kind of forbids it. But still, it's fascinating that they were considering quite heavily just giving a mountain to Finland, like as a birthday gift. And isn't that that's why you gotta love Norway. So yeah, other reasons to love Norway include the fact that they have a border with Russia, a relatively peaceful border actually. So yeah, again, bordering Russia is kind of like recipe for disaster, as you know, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, literally any country that borders Russia besides maybe North Korea can tell you. However, the interesting thing about the Norwegian border is they've been relatively safe. They haven't gone to major wars in the recent last few hundred years at the very least, and their border is also very well maintained, where there's just one border crossing. You cannot go across there on foot, so there was an interesting so, because there was a refugee crisis in Europe, I'm sure everyone knows about that, spoken about that, blah, 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 blah. A lot of refugees, to get into Norway, tried to go through Russia because it involved the least natural boundaries. So you could just go, across into one country, then from one country all the way up to Norway. Oops, hit right on the thing there. All the way up to Norway, as you can see right there. However, you can't go on foot. And if you go on a bus, then the bus company tries to stop you. So what they actually end up doing is they took bicycles across the border, and it took 6,000 refugees on bicycles before they closed the loophole. And I think that's fascinating. However, yeah, there's only one border crossing between Norway and Russia, despite having a fairly sizable border. Again, it doesn't look that big, but it actually is a fairly sizable little border here. And the only way to cross it is to have a proper, either a visa of some form to get into Russia or into the Schengen area. However, if you live in Finnmark or the surrounding areas on the Russian or on the Norwegian side, you can get a permit to just travel back and forth, and that's what most people actually do. So yeah, there's a lot of Russian-Norwegian traffic, and they have a really friendly border. Again, they're in NATO, they're in Europe, and not the EU, but the EEA, and they just have these friendly relations with Russia, because they're the exception, you know? Russia and Norway get along quite well, and that actually brings me on to the next weird Norwegian-only border situation, which is Svalbard and Jan Mayen's separate. Jan Mayen's just a fun little island that Norway owns. No one lives there permanently. There's sometimes up to 50 people, but yeah, they own an island here. The only resource there is gravel, and sometimes they extract it. It's just a random little Norwegian thing. Because guess what? Norway, they can do this stuff. So, yeah, as well as that, though, they also have Svalbard. So Svalbard, I've seen a bunch of YouTube videos on it over the past year. Maybe you have too. But in case you don't know, it is a territory owned by Norway with a bunch of weird stuff going on. You legally have to carry a gun. You know how there's the gun debate in America? You have to carry a gun here because people didn't once and they got killed by polar bears. It was a tragedy. So everyone has to carry a gun if you want to leave the city. There's only really two main settlements. There's Longyearbyen, I hope I got that right, and there is Barentsburg. And Barentsburg is Russian. That's right, there is a Russian town filled with only Russians and a few Ukrainians, and then there is a roughly Norwegian town here. And you might say, wait, why is there a Russian town? What do you mean Russian town? You're missing something here, right? What is the deal with that? But the deal with that, in case you're curious, is I think, by the way, if I'm not mistaken, there was a statue of Lenin until fairly recently. Oh, there it is! It's the bust of Lenin. Just in Barentsburg still. So why does the Soviet Union exist in Norway? Toycat, is your logical next question, I think you're going to say. And the simple answer is that Svalbard belongs to Norway, but doesn't at the same time. So it was one of the few examples of terra nullius in the world where just no one kind of owns it. And then Norway got ownership of it, but in the treaty where they gave themselves the ownership, they also, like every other signatory, which there's 30 of them, also have the right to do anything they want on Svalbard. There is no visas required to go to Svalbard, although practically you have to fly in through Oslo Airport. It's the only place they've got flights, so you have to have a Norwegian visa. But theoretically, if you wanted to fly there yourself, or there was a charter flight from Longyearbyen to any other country, you would be able to just take that naturally, and any other country can exploit the resources. However, again, only really Russia and Norway have an interest in doing so, even though a bunch of other treaties can, no one ever does. And yeah, that means Longyearbyen exists, and also Barentsburg exists, which is a coal mining town. They don't make money as a coal mining town, but Russia wants to exert their influence on the place. That it's just one of these confusing situations where only Norway could just accept that Russia has a coal mining town with a bust of Lenin. I guess it's different to a statue, just existing there. And yeah, there's the crazy thing you experience over there. And long story short, Norway is beautiful, and Norway has very bizarre but very easy borders. because they're all inland on a country which exists on the coast, they have very little to deal with. They've got, less than, a few dozen borders crossings between the whole of them. And because of that, it means it's a very easy border to enforce, even though they have this weird opposite land agreement. And even though their country has a lot higher taxes and they have to deal with that, they still manage to hold together the borders, and they do it very well and very fine. And Norway, there is just so many amazing things you realize when you go there. It's so many... Okay, so if you look at this train right here, do you see how it's like island-looking things? These are the fjords of Norway, and... the fjords. It's hard to pronounce, okay? And if you look at pretty much anyone, which is going to go onto random Google Maps, you'll see how beautiful they all actually do look. Okay, this isn't too beautiful, because it's like... It's too sunny here, but they're all like icy, beautiful stuff, and every time I've seen one, I'm like, wow, that's actually pretty good as it turns out. And yeah, this is just the stunning terrain of Norway that exists all the way up its coast, which is where all the people live. There are even like, I hear there are boat tours you can go from one to the other to the other to the other, and that's meant to be a fascinating way to see them all, but it takes like 28 days. So if you want to see all of them, there are things that can do that, but it's not really recommendable. If you want to see the Northern Lights, Tromsø is generally considered one of the better cities you can fly to do that. So there you go, Tromsø for the Northern Lights. And if you want to see a place where the native population is still intact and these days actually has good rights, this is the Sami people, by the way, then you can see that all the way in the far north. And again, I think it's interesting that like Norway has so many weird, just opposite land rules, and I really do kind of like all of them just a little bit. And yeah, the long story short on today's video is that Norway, land of exceptions, with a pretty chill border, with only one tiny exception, which had to be fought over for the longest time. But now, even that is just easy. They do it. They have lots of border checks to be done, but they have a system so they can do things fast. And yeah, Norway manages to deal with borders in a way which I find fascinating, and maybe you did too. But with that said, I hope you all enjoyed this video. That sounds like a tourism video for Norway. Like, go to Norway, it's great. Here's the truth about Norway, though. It's one of the most fascinating countries you'll ever go to, but it's also the most expensive by far. Like, the cost of things shocks you when you're like, oh yeah, I'll pick up a sandwich quickly, I need to eat because I haven't eaten in 6.5 hours because of that train journey. And I'm like, okay, I'll go to like just a little store here. Oh, it's €8 for like a packaged bad sandwich. And it's like, okay, then if you want to buy alcohol, all of the stores are owned by the government. And there's like a monopoly. It's like a state-owned monopoly, but like the idea is that they can charge higher taxes that way. So it costs something like €100 for a bottle of vodka if you want a liter of it. There's a lot of like insane prices you pay in Norway, the price to rent, the price, all these sorts of things. It's pretty crazy, but they have some of the happiest people, and they're also one of the wealthiest countries in terms of the sovereign wealth fund. Very few other countries, every other country is borrowing up to their eyeballs just to fund their current living. Like, there's going to be some, I hope not, but like there could easily be like some issue where the debt just crashes every country, crashes the world economy. But instead, Norway, instead of being like, let's borrow from the future so we can fund the now, they're like, we have lots of money, let's invest it in a fund. I think it's $1 trillion now, by the way. They've got a $1 trillion fund, and the interest on that pays for their pensions. The interest on that can fuel some of their government, and it basically means that they'll be rich forever. So go Norway, the only country that like cares enough to have a sovereign wealth fund, and also the only country you should check out in the general Norwegian area. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this video. Second channel, don't care. Goodbye.